Hello and welcome back. We are back with another short work. As I said, we are picking up some slack from one of our compatriots who's having a break. So we're doing a bunch of shorter pieces. And we're bringing today a writer that we haven't had a look at, and given his position in 18th century English literature, i.e. it's a little bit scandalous that in over 3 years we haven't looked at him, and that is Alexander Pope. But before we start, remember there is our shop. You can come across, have a look. Our shop has books and writing services. You can also come and have a look at our Redbubble shop, which has a whole load of cool, interesting things. There are a couple of designs that are especially for Christmas. There should be some more coming. So there are a whole load of fun things. You want a Christmas present? Go check them out. There you can get designs on all sorts of different things. So I'm sure you'd find something that would suit your taste. So what are we looking at today? Well, today we have Alexander Pope, and we are looking at a piece that is ascribed to Martinus Scribelius. It is a piece that more or less comes from the Scribelian Club. So, Alexander Pope, brief-ish sort of introduction for him. So, Alexander Pope was a major writer of the very early part of the 18th century. He was predominantly a wit and a satirist, so that's what his work takes in. He was a contemporary and friend of Jonathan Swift, and with Jonathan Swift, he was a member of the Scribelius Club. There are various other members which you can look up, but most of them are names that today we don't really know. Pope and Swift are the two most notable members of the Scribelius Club, so I didn't really feel like committing to memory a long list, not that long, about half a dozen, list of names of people who, unless you're a real expert in 18th century English satirists, you're probably not going to know any of them anyway. So Pope and Swift. Pope actually brought Swift into the Scribelius Club. It was a Tory-leaning club, and it enjoyed quite a bit of its time. It was active during the earliest part of the 18th century. So once the Hanover kings came with George I and George II especially, politics in England moved very strongly Whig with the first Prime Minister Walpole. Whew. All of this is relevant. And so this led a Tory-leaning Pope on sort of out of political favour, in opposition. He didn't actually have any official role in government or in court. And the reason for this, although he was born of a position that would have given him a role in public life or in court, he was born a Catholic. And this period saw a great deal of repression towards Catholic Englishmen and women after James II's attempted overthrow at the end of the 16th century after Charles II. He was overthrown. You get William and Mary period. You get your last Stuart monarch, which is Queen Anne. If you want to see Queen Anne, have a look at The Favourite. It's Olivia Colman. Just beautiful. Anyway, so this is this sort of world. It's a fairly unstable world. You then get the Hanover kings, never king of England, if not king of a small principality in Germany. Doesn't have quite the same ring as the Henry V, never king of England, if not king of France. But the Hanover kings and queens are still with us. They have been with us for nearly 300 years. So there you go. We've had, there have been a German family on the throne for nearly 300 years, as said in Blackadder, by the hapless George trying to prove he's not the German spy. I'm as English as Queen Victoria. Oh, so you're half German, you're married to a German, and your father was German. Sorry. Little digression there. Anyway, Pope. So Pope was very interested in political life, although he could not contribute to it. He was a satirist. He wrote satirical pieces. One of the things about satirical pieces which has an impact on the bulk of Pope's work is political satire is particularly prescient for the time it's written. So as those political figures move further and further into history, it becomes harder and harder to read that satire as it was originally intended. So this partly explains why a writer like Pope is less well known today than he was in his own time or a little bit later. So he is also what is known as an Augustan poet. And we're not talking of a first century Roman, but a neoclassicist. So that also gives you an idea of the style of poetry that he is writing. He is writing in a style that is evoking that early empire of Rome, early Roman Empire, that first century Augustan poetry. He's known as an Augustan poet. So like Virgil, like Horace, and like Ovid. So this is, he comes from a very, very unusual particular world. So gone is the heavy, heavy religious poetry of the 17th century. People like Milton, people like the late Marvel. I like the early Marvel, where it's all love poetry and a bit smutty, but once it starts getting religious, I get bored. Not really terribly interested in Milton myself. So that, but the 17th century sees very, very heavy religious poetry, epic poetry, but it's very heavily religious. The 18th century and Pope see a much more political and a much more classical style of poetry coming in. It's no longer this heavy, almost puritanical poetry, assuming Puritans actually like poetry, and more a lighter, frothier, funner sort of poetry with a real barb in it. So it is really, his writing is quite enjoyable to look at in that respect. You do have to do a bit of digging, get a copy like this with copious notes in the back, because you need them when reading Pope. You need, he is a writer who you can no longer go into straight cold. You actually need to start digging around in his world, because he was so cemented into his world that he doesn't lift out of it the way that some other poets do. He is very in his world, and as a result you need to understand his world. But he creates a great resource for understanding his world. To understand politics in the early 18th century, Pope is something that you are going to want to read. So that gives you a bit about Pope. The other thing about Pope is, after the 18th century, or actually towards the end of the 18th century, the 18th century is kind of a funny century when I was looking at poets. You've got people like Swift and Pope at the very beginning, and then towards the end you get the Romantics. But throughout the middle ground, poetry doesn't have any great, huge, towering figures. No one comes to mind as a mid-18th century poet. By the Romantic period, Pope's style of poetry, and Pope in particular, has fallen out of favour. Hazlitt, in his essay on envy, talks about, which was written, I think, in the early 19th century, but still within the Romantic period. Hazlitt talks about Wordsworth's attacks on Pope, and part of what's been the result of, or caused the neglect of Pope since the Romantic period, is Wordsworth's really violent attacks on Pope's style of poetry. Hazlitt attempts to moderate Wordsworth's attack by saying it's not really Pope that he's attacking, but the imitations of Pope that proliferated throughout the 18th century, which is why that middle ground of the 18th century appears pretty devoid of significant writerly or poetical voices. Like you have Popean style, you have Popean style poetry, and then you get Blake. And boy, Blake is, woo, wow. And then you get the Lake District poets, the Coleridge and the Wordsworths and that group. But that's, Wordsworth attacked the fact that poetry for much of this time, which is part of why the Romantics are what they are, they're a rebellion from this very neoclassical style. The irony is that as much as Wordsworth attacks the neoclassical style, the writers who he's attacking, the writers that Hazlitt actually probably rightly identifies as the actual issue, are the imitators of Pope. They are the people who came after Pope, who wrote in the same style, but not nearly as well as Pope. And thus, Wordsworth has mistaken the original for the copies, or blamed the original for the copycats. Hazlitt also hazards a guess that Wordsworth is jealous because he would not be able to understand, he doesn't understand what Pope is actually able to do because he is so focused on his form of poetry. He's not focused on Pope and what Pope can actually do and the value of what Pope can actually do as a poet. So this is sort of the background, is he is an incredibly famous, important, influential poet at the beginning of the 18th century who is widely imitated, and then through progressive attacks by a rival school of poetry falls into a great deal of neglect. Okay, there we go. So what are we actually having a look at? After all that talk of Pope's poetry, we're not looking at a poem. We are looking at his Peri Bathous. Now, Peri Bathous is a poetry manual. It is actually a satire of Longinus, who's a first century Augustan writer. His work on the Sublime, which is a poetry manual for writing Augustan poetry. Now, Pope is having a go at the many imitators. This is again a 1720s work. So around the same time that Swift writes his Modest Proposal, this work is coming out. So clearly the Scribelius Club is quite active and vocal about what they don't like, things that they do not like. And they are quite happy to say very loudly what they do not like. And it's very convenient to do that under the pseudonym of Martinus Scribelius, even though it was probably an open secret who they were. But if Longinus's work is about the sublime, how to make poetry high and sublime and bring out the finest elements of it, Then Pope's satire, Peri Bathous, is about the depths. Now, our modern word bathos comes from this. Bathos means to aim for the sublime and then somehow mangle it and crash land into the trivial or the mundane or the drivel. So for something to be bathos is it's high aims, but just they miss wildly. The Peri Bathous suggests that as high sublime poetry is very misunderstood and not to the public taste, that the poet of bathos, or the profound, should follow the example of what is in this text for how to produce bathos, how to produce the profound, how to produce what is popular and just considered what is popular, what is consumed, what is easy to consume, what people are lapping up in spite of quality. This is, as you probably work out, a perennial problem for anyone writing. When you know, how many people looked at things like 50 Shades of Grey or Twilight and are like, why did that sell so much? Why? It's garbage. Well, Pope is looking at what's selling and it's like, why is this selling so much? It's garbage. So if you want to write garbage, he's basically saying, this is what you do. This is how you write garbage. And he goes through and lists all the different modes in which this low poetry, this namby-pamby poetry, this was a Scribalian word, namby-pamby. There was actually a poet whom they considered namby-pamby. That was their nickname for him. This namby-pamby poetry, this dumpty-dumpty-dumpty-dump, because that is one of the criticisms of Augustan poetry, is that it has this very regular rhythm. And Wordsworth did not like this. However, the regular rhythm provides the meter. I mean, just about any form of poetry has to have some rhythm. Though if you are writing bathos, that's going to become very numpty and very namby-pamby. It's just going to bop along and you're going to get sick of it. A good poet knows where to vary things, knows how to create interest within a line. A bad poet just imitates, just takes a thing and holds on to it and, you know, will not let go, will fight over that thing, and they will decide this is the thing that I do. This is how you do it. So there is really a sense of what he is criticizing are people who are imitators of what great writers can do. Now, Pope was not having to rely on his current literary output for his income. So part of the reason why there is so much of this bathos out there in literary London is this is how you made money. You published a lot and you published often. You published a lot and often, and you scraped together the little bits of money that you could with that. So obviously, and you have this explosion of both print houses, and you have an explosion of publications that need filling. So you have an appetite for more and more and more. So no, you can't create sublime constantly, so we'll just create bathos. But Pope didn't have to worry about this. One thing Pope did was, early in his career, he published a translation of the Iliad. And he published it he set it up with his publisher for the subscribers so that he was basically taken care of for the rest of his life. This one translation that he did basically paid for his lifestyle for the rest of his life. So he was very, very lucky, but he wasn't and although he was an incredibly prolific author, he wrote a lot, but he had periods in his life where it was pretty fallow and he wasn't writing a lot. So he's in quite a privileged position compared to a lot of other writers. So he is able to make these criticisms purely because he is not in an economic position to need to produce at that level. You cannot produce when you're producing at a huge level, and quite a rate. Great things all the time. In fact, quality when you're producing large numbers is about the first thing to go. So, actually, one of the things that's quite interesting about his Iliad is that it was an attempt to not only translate the Iliad but bring it into tastes of his time. So it became this very popular. It was quite popular because it was able to pay for his lifestyle for the rest of his life, but it also tells us something about how translations worked then. Nowadays, if you get a translation of the Iliad, I have the new Robert Fagel's translation, the Pulitzer Prize winning one. One of the things that you are looking for in a translation is how close is this to the original? How close is my reading experience to the Greek? So there are certain things, like I think there's a metric foot in Greek that cannot be translated into English due to the nature of English and Greek. But we are trying, when in our time, we're trying to get as close a reading experience to the original. This was not the case in Pope's time. In Pope's time, it was almost a rewrite in the language and the fashion of the time. So you lose that sense of antiquity to create a language and a telling that, although it is a translation and he's not making cuts to the text, he is putting it into a language that is more akin to a contemporary translation of it, or a contemporary, how a contemporary person would at that time would have written it had it been written in the early 18th century. So it's quite interesting how how tastes have changed, which probably explains Keats's On Looking into Chapman's Homer for the First Time, that poem. Because it's like, how could this be so radical? Well, because the type of poet reading translations was quite different to what our experience is. I mean, if we look at, we've had a long period of about at least 100 years of trying to get as close as possible to the original in terms of our philosophy behind translation. Not so much for Pope, and not so much for Keats's world. So there you go. That's a little aside. So he was a very secure writer, and he is in a position where he can criticize the writing that is becoming a lot more commercial, economically driven, and basically a consumer product. He is seeing these things as bad for literature. So while he is a beneficiary of this emerging system, he is a major poet who is able to work without a patron, which is just as well, given he liked to stick the knife into people. Although he did manage to maintain good personal relationships with Walpole, he did like to stick the knife into his political enemies and political rivals. Not always a safe thing to do. He is in a very different position to the working writers that you see coming up through the 18th century, the concept of a working writer. So he is writing from a place of enormous privilege in some respects. In other respects, for his status as a gentleman, he is quite he is in an unprivileged state because of his faith. He never married. He was also a great admirer until a turn of Mary Worsley Montagu, who we will actually have a look at because her husband was the Turkish ambassador, and she wrote a whole bunch of letters. So we will be actually bringing her at some point. So he was a great friend of hers, but again, he never married because of a combination of very poor health and his Catholicism, which would have caused issues in terms of marriage and various other legalistic, so he felt that he couldn't do that. So he's a bit of an odd fish, is Alexander Pope. He's really interesting to look at though, especially if you are interested in 18th century politics. I don't think you can look at 18th century politics without having a look at Pope. So Peri Bathous is his sticking it at middling poets, which is ironic because he is having a go in his lifetime at exactly the same thing that Wordsworth would have a go at him about. It had nothing to do with Pope. It had to do with the imitators, but Wordsworth missed his target entirely. And Pope was probably a bigger, better target, because who's going to remember so-and-so nothing who published dozens of poems of an absolute bathos. So it is ironic that Pope himself was skewering exactly the same thing that he would in turn be criticised for producing. And that's Peri Bathous. Have a look at it. It is really interesting. It gives you an idea of what was valued in 18th century poetry by what Pope is saying. It's not this. Don't do this. So it's very interesting like that. I think that we still live in a time where you look at books and think, how on earth did that get published? That hasn't changed. The world that Pope is at times railing against, and that he will rail against much more deeply in his epic poem, the Dunciad, which we will do. We will do the Dunciad fairly soon. That world is still with us. We now live in a world where literature is a commodity. It is commodified. It is a product of the writer, the publisher. It is an economic unit. Again, we're getting to that discussion of economics that came up with A Modest Proposal, that is turning everything into an economic unit a good thing. And Pope would say, no, it's not particularly, even though he did benefit from that, he does still see that as an issue. So that is Peri Bathous. Have a read of it. It is very interesting. Get a copy with notes. I think I read it a very long time ago and didn't understand it because I had a copy without notes. I can highly recommend this one, which is the Oxford World Classics Major Works of Pope. If you are interested in getting into some Pope, this one's a really good one, and everything that we're going to be having a look at in regards to Pope is going to be in this, because I'm not buying another book. And that's the whole point of getting a Major Works one. It's got the major works. So, speaking of major works, what we're going to be doing next time, again, we're looking at little tiny things. I thought it might be interesting to have a look at another one of the great 18th century writers, one who sits in between Pope and the Romantics, and that is Samuel Johnson, who we have already met with his journey into the Highlands. But this time, what I want to have a look at is actually two things. We're going to have a look at Johnson, and we're going to have a look at Pope. And we're going to have a look at both of their prefaces to Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare in the 18th century is very, very interesting. As you can guess, we like Shakespeare here, and it is very interesting to start to look at how Shakespeare is perceived in the 18th century, because this is where the deification of Shakespeare and the lifting the man out of his time begins. So join us next time for the prefaces to Shakespeare by Pope and Dr. Johnson. So until then, farewell. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.